How's everybody doing on this glorious day? Today, we're going back into the Precon upgrade videos with the Quick Draw Precon featuring Stella Lee Wildcard. This is a point of reference here. We're going to keep Stella at the front. Her card is Stella Lee Wildcard 1, a blue and a red, human rogue. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, exile the top card of your library, and until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. Tap, copy target instant or sorcery card you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Activate only if you cast 3 or more spells this turn, and she's a 2/4. So this deck is all about second spells in order to do things, and that even matters on like your opponent's turns, because if you can cast 2 spells, you'll get an extra exile off the top, and then you have until the end of your next turn to use those spells. So this is quite a powerful card with just a little bit of setup, because she can help you with chain casting, because that's what the deck really wants to do, is to chain cast for second spell triggers. And this helps us by getting some extra impulse draws off the top, essentially. And so that next turn, you can set up everything and then start chaining these spells out. So you could have up to 3 cards in exile ready to cast by the time you get back to your next turn. And with all the cantrips in this deck, it's pretty easy to do once you start doing that and getting the impulse draws going as well. The alternative commander in this precon, though, is Eris, Roar of the Storm for 8 blue-red. It's an elemental warlock. It costs 2 less for each different mana value among instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard. It has flying and prowess, and whenever you cast your second spell each turn, create a 4/4 red dragon elemental creature token with flying and prowess, and it's a 4/4 itself. Now, with how this precon was constructed originally and with some of the upgrades that we're going to put into this, it's pretty easy to get this thing discounted down. But the amazingness on this thing is that second spell trigger creating 4/4 dragon elementals with flying and prowess. That makes me extremely happy, but what doesn't make me happy is the lack of instants in the precon. There's 9 to be exact versus the 21 sorceries. So we're going to want to be able to figure out ways to chain cast spells off turn to make as many of these dragon elements as we can while we're playing this at the front. With that said, though, we're not going to dump off most of the precon to make this work, so we're going to stick with Stella up front. Eris as the commander demands a little bit more to maximize. So let's talk about the rest of the cards exclusive to this precon, and we'll start off with the most busted in half one that's in there, and that is Crackling Spellslinger. For 3 red, 2/2 flash human wizard. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, the next instant sorcery spell you cast this turn has Storm. Storm cards in general usually have hefty costs involved, and because the more powerful they are, you're going to have to overcost them because you're going to be copying them in multiple ways. But we have never seen this kind of thing in Magic before, where you're granting this keyword to another instant or sorcery. So this can grant Storm to any instant or sorcery, and there's so many messed up cards that you could storm off into and wreck a game. And the instances of Storm actually stack up with existing cards. So if the card already had Storm, it'll have Storm twice, and it'll just keep giving them extra Storm instances. This is going to be extra disgusting with things like extra turn spells. Imagine Time Warp, where you're able to storm after you've already cantripped like 2 or 3 times. Then you get to take 3 extra turns in a row off of this. And if you have a way to bounce it back to your hand, you can do it again. It's just, oh god, there's so many ways to abuse this card. It's not even funny. Dialing back the power level quite a bit here, let's take a look at Thunderclap Drake. For 1 in the blue, it's a flying Drake, 2/1. Instant and sorcery spells you control cost 1 less to cast. You can pay 2 in a blue and sack it, and when you cast your next instant or sorcery this turn, copy it for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game, and you can choose new targets for the copy. Now, this isn't the most exciting kind of card. It's kind of the equivalent of a flying version of Goblin Electromancer, but it's a little bit better since it can attack in the air. I like these effects, though, because it assists us in chaining the multiple spells that we need per turn to get these Storm effects to go off and to get Stella Lee's effects to go off. But in the same time, this has just so much upside with that activated ability, which acts like a pseudo Storm effect, copying your next spell. But the Storm count is actually based on how often you cast your commander. This card is likely going to be better if you have Eris as the front commander instead of Stella, since it has a way to discount itself down to 2 mana, basically. Even if it gets blown up a few different times, you're more likely only going to be paying a blue and a red to cast that one over and over. But either way, I'm still running this card. Then we have a card that's kind of an interesting design, but it's kind of risky too, and that is Forger's Foundry. For 2 and a blue, it's an artifact that has tap at a blue, and when you spend mana to cast an instant or sorcery with that mana that's value 3 or less, you can exile that spell instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard as it resolves. And for 3 blue and then tap, you can cast any number of spells from the exiled cards with the Forger's Foundry without paying the mana costs, activate only as a sorcery. It's an interesting design. It's a 3 mana rock, but instead of putting the cards into your graveyard, you exile them when the spell resolves if the mana value was 3 or less. Then you can pay 5 to cast any number of them that were exiled with this thing, so you can build them up over the game. So this lends itself to Stella's 3 spells to copy things ability, or the second spell abilities, since you're casting them things all out of exile, and you don't lose them forever, because once the spells resolve off the activation, they go to your graveyard. They don't go into exile. They don't go back under the thing. They just get cast and then they land in your graveyard. It's almost like the plot mechanic from the main set, but you have to pay to activate the Foundry to get at the spells a second time. The only bad part here is if someone sits there and lets you build up the spells on it, and they have an instant speed spell to destroy an artifact, they will smash that Foundry and you will lose all the stuff on it because you can't activate it in response because it's sorcery speed only. So it's kind of a risk-reward thing. You can get a big reward, but it's a great risk unless you have some way to keep this thing from getting blown up. The next card reaches back up into the Storm scale for an ability that's pretty high up there, and that is Smouldering Stagecoach. For 300 red, it's an artifact vehicle. Its power is equal to the number of instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard, and when it attacks, the next instant or sorcery spell that you cast has Cascade, and you crew it for 2. That's a star 5. So whatever amount of instants and sorceries you have, that's how much power it has. So, like I said, we're reaching into the Storm scale. That's the scale that says, okay, how powerful is something and how likely we are to see it ever reprinted. Well, Cascade's one of those things that's pretty far up there, and you don't see it in standard anymore. You're only really going to see it in commander products and like Modern Horizons and those kind of things. This is a great way to get the second spell tricks going, though, because you're going to play the spell, you'll get the Cascade off of it, and that's your second spell once the Cascade goes off. So I really like that, and the Stagecoach here is only going to grow in power as the game goes along, so it makes it a decent threat as well. Next up is Layline Dowser. For 2 colorless, it's an artifact that has 1 on the tap, mill a card. You can put an instant or sorcery card milled this way into your hand, and it has tap an untapped legendary creature you control to untap the Dowser. So I want to call this card a slot machine. You're paying 1 for a pull of the lever, and the spinning reel is going to be whatever you milled in. If you line up a match, an instant or sorcery, you get a win, and you're rewarded for it by bringing it back to your hand. But if you don't hit it, it just goes to your graveyard, and you get nothing for it. But you can also just keep pulling that lever if you have an untapped legend laying around and extra mana to work with to reactivate it. So it's an odd design, but it's one I think that works pretty well. And it's a lot more interesting than making a mana rock that just says pay 2, tap it, draw a card, discard a card, or things like that they've already done in the past. Then we have another Storm spell in Elemental Eruption. For 4 red, as a sorcery, create a 4/4 red dragon elemental creature token with flying and prowess, and it has Storm. So this is more Storm for our casting pleasure, and we get more of the prowess dragon elementals like Eris creates off of this. And if you haven't figured it out yet, I really like the prowess ability, and I like tokens. So this kind of card greatly pleases me. Then we have a brand new card drawing spell in Lock and Load. For 2 and a blue sorcery, draw a card, then draw a card for each other instant and sorcery you've cast this turn. Then it has Plot for 3 and a blue, so you exile it face up, and you can cast it on a later turn without paying for it again. So more support for the chain casting theme of the Precon. It flows nicely into the Storm effects that the deck wants to have going on, and it's going to refill your hand nicely if you plan when you can cast this, and it's a lot easier to do with the Plot mechanic stapled onto the card. Just remember, Plot lets your opponent know that you have this thing exiled, but this one's a little harder to judge since they will have to wait until you're ready to start chaining your spells to see how many cards you're actually going to get off of it, and by then they might not have the mana available to even stop you from doing it. So there's a lot of nuance to this particular card. And then the last new card that's exclusive to the Precon is Pyic Charge. For 4 and a red, sorcery, discard your hand, draw 4, and then for each card you've discarded this way, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn, and it plots for 3 and a red. Okay, now this is a really, really nice red finisher that just isn't about, insurrection, steal all your opponent's creatures and smash them with it, or a gigantic burn spell like Comet Storm. For 5 mana, you draw 4. That hasn't been seen in the game in a long time, and usually it has some kind of downside when it does show up, and that's where the discard part of this comes in. But in this case, you could seriously smash your opponents to pieces with a big enough hand, or just copying this of things enough times with the Storm effects and the card or spell copying abilities that are going to be in the deck. This would be an ideal target for Crackling Spellslinger, granting it Storm since you could plot it, build up a little Storm count, and then cast the Spellslinger with this behind it, and it just makes certain doom for the table if you have enough creatures on the board to win with it. All right, we talked about the new cards that are coming in the deck, and I'm not going to remove any of those, but we are going to remove some of the other cards from the deck, so let's take a look at those. Just like I did with the Desert Bloom Precon, I'm going to tell you what I'm taking out, why I want to take it out, and what I'm going to replace it with in the deck. Let's start off with Epic Experiment. For X blue-red sorcery, exile the top X cards of your library, and you can cast instants or sorceries with mana value X or less from among them without paying their mana cost. Put all the cards exiled this way that weren't cast into your graveyard. I'm not a big fan of this card to begin with, and I don't like the fact that, you know, we have other things going on. Yes, you can get, you know, basically free casts off of stuff, but then anything that you don't cast or can't cast, like artifacts and creatures, they just get dunked into the graveyard, and there's not a lot of ways to get those things back built into the deck, even as the precon, let alone what stuff we're going to add into the deck. So I'm not a fan of this card, so it's getting punted out of the deck. Instead, we're going to add to the storm count here and add in 1,000-Year Storm, 4 blue-red enchantment. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, copy it for each other instant sorcery spell you've cast before it this turn, and you can choose new targets for the copies. So we're going to go ahead and storm off even harder here with 1,000-Year Storm. So we should have no problem gaining extra copies of things to really mess around with and cast into the storm to get just a big ball of win cons going on. I'm also going to take out the copy of Arcane Bombardment, 4 red enchantment. Whenever you cast your first instant or sorcery spell each turn, exile an instant or sorcery card from the graveyard at random, and then copy each card exiled with Arcane Bombardment. You can cast the copies without paying their mana cost. Now, here's the thing. I don't want to be exiling spells out of my graveyard because, one, the Eris wants to have those in the graveyard so you can actually bring him out for cheaper, and there's other ways to regrow spells out of the yard. You might want to reuse them. There's just ways that you don't want to lose these spells for the rest of the game under the bombardment, because then if it gets destroyed, those are gone, you're just screwed. Instead, we're going to use a copy of Storm of Saruman from the Lord of the Rings set for 4 blue, same cost, just in blue. Ward 3. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, copy it, except for the copy isn't legendary, and you can choose targets for the copy. So what's neat about this is we don't have to have an instant or sorcery. You can actually copy your creatures or artifacts or other enchantments as well. And this has its own self-built-in protection mode attached to it, unlike the Arcane Bombardment, and we don't have to worry about it. Plus, it lends itself to the second spell theme of the deck versus the bombardment eating stuff out of our graveyard. Now, a secondary theme of this deck is discounting the instants and sorceries that we have in the deck to make them cheaper to keep chain casting. So they included a copy of Kaza Royal Chaser that I'm going to remove. Blue-red 1/2 human wizard with flying and haste, and you can tap it, and the next instant or sorcery you cast this turn costs X less, equal to the number of wizards you control as the ability resolves. There's only one problem. There's only, about 8 to 9 wizards in the precon, and that's not really that great. You might get a small burst of, maybe 2 or 3 mana discounter off, and you have to tap this to do it. So instead, I'm going to go back to Murders at Karlov Manor and a commander that I actually did the videos on, Melik Reforged Researcher for 3 blue-red. It's a star weird detective with power and toughness equal to double the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. The first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn costs 3 less to cast. This allows us to get a discount that's, you're going to average out at about 2 to 3 mana coming off with Kaza, where you get a guaranteed 3 mana. With this on the board, it costs a little bit more, but you don't have to jump through hoops to get there. You don't have to tap the creature to get there, and it still affects just the first spell that turn. So it's just a nice way to do it without the extra effort, and you get a decent sized threat in the process. We're also going to remove the copy of Tezzeret's Gambit, 3 and a Phyrexian blue sorcery, draw 2 cards, proliferate. There are not a lot of things in this deck that actually care about +1/+1 counters or charge counters or any of that stuff that proliferation would actually care about. So I'm trying to figure out why they even slotted this into the deck, other than it was a draw spell that you could cheapen up and, essentially get it for almost nothing. But at the same time, it's like you're just drawing 2 cards. You're not really proliferating anything. So I went ahead and took it out of the deck. So instead, we're going to slot in a copy of Empty the Warrens for 300 red, create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, and it has Storm. So you're chain casting spells anyway. So this is a great way to storm off, create a bunch of little tokens that can then pick up that power bonus off of the Pyic Charge and smash into your opponents and win the game. And if you cast something like the Crackling Spellslinger underneath of this before you go off, it'll storm off twice when you do it, so you can get 2 sets of copies. So this is just a cool card to have included. I'm also going to remove the one random counter spell in the deck, Arcane Denial, 1 in a blue instant counter target spell. Its controller may draw up to 2 cards at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep, and you draw a card at the next turn's upkeep as well. So, you know, I'd be okay if there was more than just one counterspell included in the precon, but this is it. This is the one counterspell. It's kind of like, okay, that was random. So we're just going to go ahead and take it out. If we're going to run one, we really don't need any. So that's coming out, and we're going to put in a copy of Howl of the Horde instead for 2 and a red sorcery. When you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy the spell, choose new targets, and it has raid. If you attacked with a creature this turn, when you cast your next instant or sorcery, you copy it twice instead and choose new targets. So we're got kind of a little bit of a battle mage thing going on with this deck, where we're making creatures, making tokens, and we're going to be swinging at our opponents. So it should be pretty easy to copy stuff twice off of this, and it just chains into other things that we have going on. The next card I'm going to remove is Pteramander for a blue. It's a 1/1 Salamander Drake with flying, and then 7 in a blue, adapt 4. It costs 1 less to activate for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. It just feeds into the instants and sorceries theme of the deck, but it's not that great of a card. Dies really easily, and they can kill it in response to the activation even. So it's not all that. It used to be really good, but it's not that great. So we're going to take it out, and instead we're going to slot in a copy of a Layline of Anticipation. For 2 blue, it's an enchantment that if it was in your opening hand, you can put it on the battlefield at the beginning of the game, and you can cast spells as though they had flash. Now, remember when I was complaining about how many instants and sorceries were ratioed into this deck? Well, this is a way to get around a lot of that and make all those sorceries into instants for us, so we can cast them off turn in order to get Stella Lee's second spell triggers and Eris's second spell triggers and everything else to kind of flow as the game goes along. And my next removal is probably going to be controversial, but I don't care. It's a power level thing more than an actual, you know, it doesn't work kind of thing, and that is Niv Mizzet Perun for triple blue, triple red. It's a 5/5 Dragon Wizard, can't be countered, flying. When you draw a card, it deals 1 damage to any target, and when you cast anybody casts an instant or a sorcery spell, you draw a card, which then lets you ping somebody. This card can overtake a game, and you know, that's great and all, but it tends to lead to people to want to build around him rather than the other commander, and I don't want to leave that temptation there for myself or anybody else if you wanted to copy what I'm doing here. So I'm taking it out of the deck just because of how strong this thing can be. Instead, we're going to include a new card from the main set, Fibblethip, Lost on the Range. For 1 blue, it's a 1/1 Homunculus with Ward 2. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. Top card of your library has plot, and its plot cost is equal to its mana cost, and you can plot non-land cards from the top of your library. So with this, we're trying to use this as a way to get the whole second spell thing going, because we can plot a card off the top and save it for a following turn, and then plot it off the next turn and start chaining spells together. And I thought it'd just be kind of fun to include Fibblethip in the deck so that we get a little more of that Outlaws of Thunder Junction flavor going on in the deck. Now, the next card I'm removing for the same reasons I removed Arcane Bombardment, and that is Dig Through Time. 6 blue, Delve. Look at the top 7 cards of your library, put 2 into your hand and the rest on the bottom in any order. I don't like removing stuff from my graveyard. I don't want to delve away my instants and sorceries because they benefit us having them in the graveyard, so I don't want to include this one in the deck anyways. We're going to replace it, though, with a card that does exile spells, but only 2 of them, 1 instant and 1 sorcery at a time, but it gives us free casts off of this, and that is Spell Twine. 5 in a blue, exile an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, and another instant or sorcery from an opponent's graveyard. Copy the cards, cast the copies if able without paying the mana cost, and then exile the Spell Twine. So you're going to get 2 free casts off of this, and then you'll hit the third basically with the Spell Twine, but you're only going to lose 1 card from your yard and 1 card from their yard in order to do this, and then you get to cast them off for free. So I like this better than Dig Through Time in the deck. We're also going to remove the 1 random Propaganda in the deck. 2 in a blue enchantment. Creatures can't attack you unless they pay 2 for each creature they control that's attacking you. I find this card is better in decks where you can stack multiples of this style of effect, this taxation. And that way, if they remove one of them, you still have redundancies back behind them, or you'd make it so it's just impossible for them to attack through and hit you. Whereas this is just one card, and we don't have any ways of cloning the enchantment that often off of this. So I think I would rather prefer just to run something else over that, and that something else actually comes from the Clue version of the Ravnica set that we just had. Corporeal Projection for a red and a blue. You get a sorcery. Target creature you control gains Myriad until end of turn, or you overload it for 3 blue, blue, red, red. So each creature you control gains Myriad until the end of turn. Now, Myriad makes it so when the creature attacks, a token copy of it is created, attacking each of your opponents. So if you've made multiples of those Prowess Dragons, or you've made multiple tokens off of the Storm of the Goblin card or whatever, and plus your other creatures on the board, you can make Corporeal Projection copies of them and just overrun the board this way. So I really like this card in the deck, and I wanted to run it in here. And our last removal is Electrostatic Field for 1 and red, 0/4 defender. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. I'm not big into the whole plinking thing with this deck. If I'm going to run this in a deck that's worried about that kind of thing, I will run many, many, many more redundant versions of this in the deck. We're going to take this out, and instead, since we have the whole battle mage type thing going on where we're trying to attack our opponents with prowess creatures and stuff like that, we're going to include a copy of Balmor, Battle Mage Captain for blue-red, 1/3 bird wizard with flying. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain trample until end of turn. So this works out really nice and is very thematic in the whole chaining of spells that we're trying to do, because you can get, 3, 4, more damage on all of your creatures and give them trample as well, be able to come through and smash across the plate as we're going through this with Balmor on the field, rather than messing with an electrostatic field that you might get 4 or 5 damage on a chain of casts. Whereas this actually multiplies by however many creatures you have on the board when you're doing these chain casts. And of course, we're going to talk about some of the pricier or power upgrades that I would include here if I was messing around with them. First up is Edgin Larsenist Ludus for 1, a blue and a red. Legendary creature, human bard. Each non-land card in your hand has Foretell if it didn't already have it, and its Foretell cost is equal to its mana cost reduced by 2. And then whenever you cast your second spell each turn, goad target creature an opponent controls, and it's a 3/3. So as part of the whole second spell theme of the deck, Edgin here would make an interesting choice to start pointing your opponent's creatures at each other as you're trying to already do this double cast theme anyways. And the Foretell bit is nice here because someone is packing discard. You're going to want to be able to protect certain cards before they can get to them, and you can just go ahead and foretell them out of your hand and into exile. But sadly, the card is almost $30 because it was part of the D&D Secret Lair that tied into the movie last year, and it's only going to get more expensive over time because it's not going to get reprinted. Of course, reprints really didn't help with the cost of the next 2 cards, and that is Deflecting SWAT and Fierce Guardianship. I grouped these 2 together because if you can afford them and need the protection for your commander or your board, you should likely be playing them. But even that, with the recent reprints that we've had just last year, they still command a $30+ price tag on each one of them. Same thing with Cyclonic Rift, which I've said before, and I will say it again. If you're in blue and you're not playing Rift, you need a good reason. In this case, the price at $30 is the reason I didn't auto-slot it into the main grade of the upgrade section. But if you have one, and it is still the best blue reset available to us in Commander. And the last card I would recommend as part of it's a power thing, not an expense thing, is Omniscience. If this thing resolves, you will win the game on the spot most of the time, since you can start chaining spells out of your hand to easily get the second spell, and the storm count triggers off of it, and that just can feel obnoxious to some play groups. So feel that out before you just drop this in and go ham. So those are my thoughts on the quick draw precon and some ideas for upgrading the deck and trying to tune it into more of a second spell style deck. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you like what I'm doing here, please like, share, comment, subscribe. All those things help my channel as I'm trying to grow to my first 1,000 subscribers. And as always, thank you for watching. Have a great day. Grand Larceny is coming up soon.